Good afternoon. Would the guests please rise and join in singing the processional hymn, Onward Christian Soldiers. The words are in an insert in your program, and we ran out of programs, so please share. Thank you. Good afternoon. My name is Gail Merceth. I was a friend of Les's for 40 years here in Cambridge. On behalf of the family, I'd like to welcome you to this celebration of Les's life. This place is especially appropriate since 38 years ago, Les and Susan were married in the Appleton Chapel, and his daughter Emily and grandson Dominic were christened there. Les, along with many others, was saddened by the recent loss of Peter Gomes, the minister here for many years. As a speaker himself, Les was intrigued by Peter's approach to giving a sermon and his interpretation of religion. Over the years, they had some good debates on the street and in Peter's office. As we begin, I'd like to say two things. First, as a lasting tribute to Les, a fund has been set up in his name to ensure his methods of teaching will continue to be available through videos, tapes, and his books. And secondly, we're following a script today that Les himself had wanted. He said this day should be joyful, a bit unexpected, and above all, humorous and not laudatory. These requests were made over the years, more often than not in Les's usual style of short notes on previously discarded paper rescued from the wastebasket. So with his wishes in mind, let us now enjoy our recollections of Dr. Leston Laycock Havens.
Hello, my name is Rick Larson, and while my remarks are labeled Williams and tennis, my connection to Les's college years are tenuous at best. I did go to Williams, but I was born in 1947, the year he graduated. But it is interesting what I have learned about his college years in the outpouring of powerful feelings and messages we have all received since his death. You will note that things he participated in at Williams were repeated in some form throughout his life. He was on the debating team, winning an award for extemporaneous speaking. He was a member and president of Phi Beta Kappa and went to its Washington headquarters to protest when an applicant was refused admission for some spurious reason. He was head of the philosophy study group that recruited speakers for the college. His major was English, literature, and American history. What Les and I did share across 3 decades was a real love of our experiences at Williams and the fact that we had both been taught tennis at a very young age. It was like second nature to us and a key part of the rest of our lives. Les played on the Williams tennis team from the moment he arrived, and nobody ever looked better in shorts. What legs! Even when he was old, his legs were great. After Williams, he maintained his high level of achievement on the court and was the tennis pro at the Bridgehampton Tennis Club, where his family had summered since he was a boy and his job had been to roll the clay courts. He played at the Heights Casino in Brooklyn during the winter, and then in Newton when he moved to Massachusetts until he moved to Cambridge. He was a member of the Cambridge Tennis Club from 1973 to 2008. During that time, he entered the New England Senior Doubles Championships with Nick Newman. They were unseeded and won. Les and I met at the Cambridge Tennis Club back in 1973 and began a quarter century of doubles together. We played against great cast of characters, some of whom are here today. Ted Sexton, Peter Ambler, Rick Hunt, Norman Sherry, Stan Farwan, Joe Green, to name a few. It was wonderful to see how it annoyed our opponents that Les never really had to move much on the court. Why? Because he anticipated every shot that came his way. As we all know, Les had a big heart. And one of the reasons he was the best doubles partner I ever had, and it was because of that heart. He was that truly rare competitor who could revel in an opponent's success even as he thrilled to win each point. He played until he was 80, when he simply could not play the game anymore, and still he fought to keep his racket. Most important, on the court, he was always a gentleman, but with a mischievous nature that made every match interesting. Our between points conversations were some of the best I ever had. Not to steal anyone's thunder, but I think he did some of his best professional work on the tennis court. When he cocked that head of his to the side, you knew that you were about to get a little bit of incisive wisdom, whether it was about the jerk on the other side of the net, love, sex, or world peace. We Norwegians have a phrase we use when talking about our death process. It begins, "When I go to my father's." Well, when I go to my father's, Les is going to be one of them. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Chris Havens. I'd like to thank the Academy for, I'm sorry, it's the wrong speaker. First, in this political year, let me acknowledge the presence of the Governor and First Lady, for whom I had the honor of voting for president in 1988. Many active Cambridge politicos are here, Nancy Sensenbach and more, all still fighting the good fight. My father wasn't a political animal, yet he expanded the space for those kinds of ideas and all of our ideas during the 1960s. One of our victories here today, Norma and Aaron Fink are here today, one of our victories in the political arena in the 60s. Without rehashing the yin and yang of that overhyped decade, let me speak of the wonderful freedom of mind that came forth then all over the world, including Newton, Massachusetts. Dad had many friends and colleagues who enriched his life, who gave him ideas and with whom he exchanged and enlarged his own ideas. Many of you are here today. I believe his work and life in the 1960s were the foundation that led to his remarkable series of articles and books in the 70s and 80s. Our little world of West Newton had so many men and women of ambition, intellect, and attainment, covering the creative, intellectual, and religious worlds. Writers and doctors, artists and clergymen, working hard and playing hard. While my father was not a party animal, he was in a special place to live, work, and create. Tennis, as you've heard about, at which he was quite good, was his social time. His doubles partner and close friend, Danny Rothenberg, here today, is a creative and dynamic real estate wizard straight out of a Saul Bellow novel, and a devoted friend of our family. For many years, Danny and Dad took long walks, enjoying, enlightening, and informing each other. Pete Gurney, better known as the playwright A.R. Gurney, was also a tennis man and taught English at MIT at the beginning of his career. Pete told us how much my father encouraged his early writing, which was then avant-garde work we went to see in downtown Boston. Pete threw questions at him constantly and expressed doubt about psychoanalysis, which Dad was bound to defend, at the same time sharing that doubt while practicing psychoanalysis. My cousin, brother, Mark Finn's father, once asked Dad what analysis was really like. This was at Christmas time, and we were sitting there. And my father said he didn't know, as his first doc said nothing whatsoever, and his second analyst yelled at him all the time. Grace Episcopal Church and Reverend Tom Lehman were greatly respected by my father then, yet our church-going community was in many ways morally led by the MIT chaplain, author, and teacher, Myron Bloy, whose children are with our family today and part of our family. Myron was a passionate advocate for justice, God's existence, and the perfectibility of man. You can imagine my dad's mix of agreement and skepticism, given the public's mental health experience a half a century ago wasn't very supportive of those ideals, nor it is today. Myron and Don Shern, a serious intellectual teaching at MIT as well, whose wife Nancy and daughters Ellen and Susan are here today, formed a mini debating society with my father covering every concern. The Shern's house was an art gallery then, and now Nancy is a practicing artist today. Don and Dad engaged in a decades-long dialogue. Don noted in his book, The Reflective Practitioner, how my father's development of a systemic eclecticism made some sense of the babble of voices in psychiatry. This is the sense both he and you try to make of the babble of voices today, both in the profession and in your patients' minds. Dad's life revolved around books, making for his family a world of books and magazines. We really read and collect books today. How could we not, surrounded both by those books and the flood of wonderful magazines? I don't know why I always think of this, but it's always the New Yorker, Life, Look, Time. When that got too conservative, Newsweek, Scientific American, New England Journal of Medicine, many more, and the Daily New York Times and the Boston Globe. Recalling Steve Greenberg's hilarious speech, some of which you heard at Dad's retirement roast, where he told stories about my father on the theme of the frozen and the chosen. I think back to the 60s, a time of a new and growing relationship between our two tribes, very much active in Newton at that time. Dad was among those leading that mix, making our lives bigger and better and changing how we saw the world and leaving behind the narrow 1950s. He engaged all of us seriously and did so all of his life. His friends did the same, talking to us outspoken teenagers, honestly, arguing us and teaching us. Myron Bloy once said, you don't believe in God, let's go up a mountain with a bottle of bourbon and, I'll straighten that out. True story, in his kitchen. To me, our most significant inheritances from him are both an attitude of mind and an effectiveness of language. Open-mindedness, in short supply today, burst forth brilliantly then. During the 60s, a hinge in history of great and wrenching change, my father created a safe place, our father created a safe place to give both our ideas and our ideals a chance, rejecting dogma and dead stop ideology, using effective language to get close to human truth. He taught us we must never stop reaching for that truth, if only because we will never know if we got there. God bless.
Good afternoon. I'm Susan Strang. Les and I were colleagues at Cambridge Hospital for several years, and our families have been friends for many years. Not long ago, I was asked to undertake the task of helping the family with Les's papers and drafts. We started off with 2 modest file cabinets on the second floor at 151, and then I was told that perhaps I hadn't been given the full truth. So into the basement we went, and there they stood, 6 or 8, I can't remember, tall 4-drawer gray-black file cabinets looming in the basement light. Well, it was a privilege and an honor to go through all those drafts of his own work, the drafts that many colleagues and friends here today sent to him for comments, the notes on top of the drafts, the correspondence. It was so rich and wonderful. And as a result, there's a particular gem that I've been asked to share with you today. and it is some correspondence between the late Senator Edward Kennedy and Les, and the first letter begins deliciously, "Dear Ted, I am writing because of the coming senatorial election and out of my interest in rehabilitation. I am the chief psychiatric consultant of the Mass Rehab Commission and in charge of training rehabilitation counselors at the Harvard Medical School. I am very interested in knowing what policies and attitudes you have had to formulate in relation to rehabilitation problems. In one of the recent debates, you mentioned your interest in retraining unemployed workers. And there are, as you know, also rehabilitation problems in relation to other welfare cases, Social Security cases, the mentally ill, and the retarded, and a number of other groups. One significant problem, for example, is the current difficulty in getting adequate medical treatment, especially for mentally disabled people. I appreciate how intensely busy you must be these days, but hope that you will have a chance to give this at least some attention." This is a letter from 1962. And there is a rather quick reply. "Dear Dr. Havens, I want to thank you very kindly for your most informative letter of September concerning the problems of rehabilitation involved in welfare and other cases. As president of the Joseph P. Kennedy Foundation, I have been immensely interested and concerned in how these problems can best be met. Needless to say, I am fully aware of the necessity of making maximum use of the potential of those people who've been unfortunate enough to suffer from mental illness. I certainly think that this problem should be considered as part of the overall need for manpower retraining. I should be delighted to have the benefit of your own views on this important question, and I hope that you will not hesitate to write me further. Furthermore, I would be happy to arrange a meeting with my associates, although I would very much like to have such a discussion with you personally. However, as I'm sure you can understand, my schedule requires me to spend a considerable amount of time away from my office. I am looking forward to the pleasure of hearing from you in the future. With best wishes, sincerely, Edward Kennedy." And the last reply has the heart of the matter. "Dear Mr. Kennedy, thank you for your letter. I am writing at this time to mention to you 3 or 4 principles which I am eager to introduce into your thinking, if they are not already firmly planted there. I do not intend to present them here in any detail, although a time will undoubtedly come at your convenience, and as you suggest, when I might be worth discussing them with you. The interest in rehabilitation is spreading very widely, not only into concern for the mentally ill, but also concern with welfare cases, Social Security, and of course, into the prisons. So many of these problems are ones that stir up special feeling that I know it is going to require a great deal of courageous leadership to be sure that sound principles are followed. Heaven knows I have no monopoly on sound principles, but I did want to list here a few things that seem to me of central importance. Number 1, the extension of the rehabilitation idea to more and more groups of our citizens is going to require an extensive educational effort to prepare government workers to deal wisely with the people involved. Number 2, many of our civil service arrangements will need to be thought through again if the human needs to be met are not to be cut off because of difficult administrative procedures. 3, much political leadership will be needed to deal with the accusations that have been brought against welfare, that it encourages chiseling and dependency. The fundamental problem is how to give people help without hurting them. Because we are committed on a broad scale to caring for our people with the resources at our rich country's command, there is no question of our turning back away from assistance to the needy and disabled. There is a question, however, as to whether we are going to undertake it legalistically and mechanically or with understanding of the special psychological problems involved. I hope these matters do not seem intrusive at this very busy time in your life, but that they might bear fruit in your thinking and in the years of work ahead. The wonderful thing is that Les really believed that for each of us there was a new day, a new dawn, a new life perhaps, and he wished that not only for his family, his patients, his colleagues, and his friends, he wished it for everyone. For everyone. And as we gather today, this beloved community, in this year, and see a broken world, we should remember that in the next breeze, in the next turn of the calendar page, there might be something better for each and every one of us. And every time we have that thought and feel that way about our fellow citizens, as well as our colleagues and our friends and our families, every time we feel that that's what everyone deserves, we honor Leston Havens. May it always be so.
Good afternoon. I'm Ed Hundert, a lifelong student of Les's. One of Les's many legacies is the legion of us psychiatrists who, as medical students, took an elective reading with Les. Quick show of hands, how many people here at some point did some reading with Les? Look at that. Connected to every one of those hands is a memorable and meaningful story that could be told here today. And I know my month reading with Les led to almost 10 years of monthly faculty club lunches together, where Les encouraged me and prodded me and constantly encouraged me to feel like I could accomplish so much more than I ever thought possible. But my charge today is to focus on that reading month, how profound it was for us medical students to have our guru give us his deep personal attention as we discussed our reading together. I learned about Les's reading elective from a fellow student just before a conference where Les was coming to interview a patient chosen because none of the residents had been able to get so much as even a basic history from this poor woman whose experience was so completely filled with terrifying hallucinations. Les came in, pulled his chair up next to hers, and within a few minutes proceeded to have about a half-hour pretty normal conversation about who she was and her life, and she talked about how she had worked as a clerk at the MIT Coop, and she remembered selling the very last slide rule that they stocked before calculators came in. Afterward, Les took questions, and one of the residents asked why he thought that patients who hear voices so often think that it's the voice of God that they hear. He paused and then said, "You know, there are a lot of kinds of suffering, physical pain, for example, but the kind of suffering that our patients experience really is the worst kind of human suffering. And God doesn't talk to just anyone." And he just left it there. So the next time I spotted him on the ward, I raced over and asked if I could sign up for one of his reading months. He said he would look forward to it, and he later let me know that I should read in advance the book that we would discuss at the first session together, Carl Jasper's General Psychopathology. So I wondered, do current medical students actually read through the General Psychopathology and discuss it with their professors? And if not, what does that singular change mean for psychiatry? Well, after we discussed Jasper's, he assigned me John William Miller's In Defense of the Psychological, which affected my thinking more than I think any other single book I'd ever read. These were like classic Oxford tutorials, where the wise tutor listens to his young charge discuss the last reading, and then chooses the next reading based both on appreciation of the student's ongoing misconceptions and on insight into which texts will best challenge the student's growth to the next level of understanding. It was during our discussion of In Defense of the Psychological that I confided to Les that I had a contract with Oxford Press to write a book on various approaches to the mind. And he replied, "Well, in that case, maybe the next thing we should discuss together is a little effort I cobbled together with that same title." And so we moved on to his approaches to the mind, and my life was never the same. Now, my hypothesis was that Les used these reading months to size us up, to sort us, a little bit like Hogwarts sorting hat, with Les as Dumbledore thinking through, which type of psychiatry, which residency and training director would be the right fit for each of us. Now, Les made it pretty clear that he didn't want a lot of mushy talks at moments like this, as was said. You'll recall that he only agreed to that event in '96 if it were done as a roast to make fun of his foibles as we celebrated his contributions. And so for that event, I wrote a poem that I have adapted a bit for today. And so I'll finish with an ode to Leston. This celebration of Les Haven's life, his friendships, his students, and his great works gives us cause not just to honor this man, but also to smile as we remember his quirks. A teacher, a mentor, a scholar, a sage, Les Haven's roles filled crannies and nooks. A clinical wizard and prolific writer of dust jacket blurbs for other folks' books. Like so many others here in this room, I first met Les when in student days I spent a month reading a few classic texts and found myself under his quizzical gaze. Does some message lurk in those odd facial frowns? I wondered in each of my weekly trips. And why, after each time he described someone as truly remarkable, did he pout his lips? And who but Les Havens could get away with such lines that he often was heard out to toss, like, "Did you read last week's London Review?" Or, "I was just rereading some Habermas." Les's distinctive love-hate relation with psychoanalysis was one of his hooks. But humans are complex. 3 words, incidentally, which also summarize all of his books. What was the secret of this man's great gift for nurturing growth in the careers of hundreds of students and colleagues he helped learn to be human over the years? Was it creation of a safe place to make contact with empathy rife and approach the mind of each willing victim, this participant observer coming to life? I think it was Les's unique combination of a seriousness that bound him so tightly, along with his favorite Chesterton line that angels can fly because they take themselves lightly. So when they look back on the century just ended, their history will likely divide into 3, the badges of honor claimed by the people who practiced the art of psychotherapy. Those in the first generations claimed Freud, provided them personal couch space rental. Then came the years of those who claimed proudly they trained under Simrad out at Mass Mental. But the last third of the 20th century will be marked by generations now destined to talk not of Sigmund or Elvin, but rather the month in med school when I read with Leston.
My name's Alex Sabo. Like Ed, I'm a lifelong student of Les's. And Susan had asked me to tell a couple vignettes from my training, so I'll do that. I first met Les when I was 30 years old. I had worked hard to become a medical doctor, and my internship year at Cambridge Hospital had been the most difficult year of my life. It was so in the sense that my time and my being had not been my own. I had felt owned and used by others, almost a prisoner or slave to the clinical service needs of a city hospital. I'd served my time and bowed to my various guards and the warden. Now, I was about to become a psychiatrist, to begin training. My desire to become a psychiatrist had been my major goal for many years. One morning in late June of 1984, Les met with 7 new PGY2 residents in a conference room in the old Mocht building. He made a speech to us that went something along these lines. Welcome to Cambridge Hospital. It's the best of the teaching programs at Harvard. I was at Mass Mental for a while, and for a long time, it was the top Harvard program. But now, I think Cambridge Hospital, it's definitely the best. He gave some reasons for his determination, mentioning some of the great figures in which they each represented, indicating that his proclamation was carefully considered and accurate. You, and he stared around the room at each of us, you're the best residents in the Harvard programs, and we have important work to do here. So, the first thing you need to know is that I'll need you to lie to your supervisors. We residents exchanged glances with each other nervously. Was this some first day test of our moral fiber? Were we supposed to shout out, no, no, we won't lie, no, never? Was this guy nuts? All right. This isn't the Boy Scouts, he went on. You're taking care of patients, and lives are at stake. If you don't lie to your supervisors, they'll steer you down some well-worn path of their own prejudice, and you'll never learn how to help your patients. You have the talent to do what's needed, but you'll never do it by trying to figure out what your supervisors want to hear and mimicking them like monkeys. All right? Instead, tell them what they want to hear, then create some working space for you and your patient, and try out what you think will work. Then see what actually works. Discover what works. That's how we'll advance the field. That's what we need you to do. Wow, my shackles had just been cut. But would this guy, Havens, lead me down the road to perdition? I felt joy and excitement for what we were about to do. This was the first of a number of experiences I had with Les, where he said something succinct and startling. He often communicated that way. No one I had ever met did this. One would not be sure why he said it and what he meant completely, but when he applied it in the right situation, it worked. At times we would ask him about these statements, and his usual explanations were actually quite sensible, based on a deep understanding of human nature, a scholar's command of a vast psychotherapeutic and philosophical literature, and then his utterance was distilled into one comment or phrase, uttered with just the right affect, and it achieved so much. Calmed a patient, helped a person feel less alone, got young doctors to think. I'll give one more example. I was chief resident on the inpatient psychiatric unit at Cambridge Hospital. I supervised 2 PGY2 residents. A manic woman in her 40s was a patient on the unit. She would not leave me alone. She followed me everywhere, constantly talking to me loudly and badgering me, putting her face inches away from mine. She wouldn't take any medication, and she wouldn't cooperate with the PGY2 resident or anyone else on the unit. She was very invasive. I walked into a therapy room where Les was waiting to give me my weekly hour of supervision. He asked, "How can I help you?" I explained that this patient was torturing me from the moment I walked onto the floor until the moment I left. I gave him the history. Les thought about it. Then he said, "Mania is the most difficult condition to address through language, much more difficult than paranoia or depression." Despite the low probability that he'd be able to help me, he'd give it a try. He said, "We need to be brave. We'll need something clear and simple," and said with strong emotion, "I'll think of something." Just as he said that, he was seated over here on the left corner of the room. I was here, and the door was here, and the woman who was going through the manic episode burst in at me. You know, she saw me through a window in the door. The manic woman burst in, began to rail against me, as was her custom. Les sat in that far corner, right over here, looking down at the floor. He said in a moderate volume and with an angry voice, "Shit! Shit!" He just looked at the floor, and every 5 to 10 seconds, he repeated the word, "shit, shit," not looking up, just off in the corner. After a few of these expletives, the woman stopped haranguing me and looked up at him. "Who is that man?" she demanded. "That's Havens," I said. Les kept saying, "Shit, shit," and he kept looking at the floor. "What's he doing here?" she asked indignantly. "He's a psychiatrist who tries to help me," I said. She looked angry and left the room. Les said, "Well, I don't know if that did any good." I just looked at him, not asking any more questions. Right? My supervision was over, so I went to the community meeting. The manic woman decided to come to the community meeting for the first time. And when the medical director of the unit convened the meeting, she raised her hand. Again, this was totally new behavior. When the medical director called on her, she said, "Can everyone here read that sign over the door?" It had the symbol of radiation on it, and it said something like, "People's feelings, be careful of them." So she pointed everyone's attention to it. The manic woman said, "People do have feelings. We all have feelings, and everyone on this unit should be careful of them. There is a Harvard professor on this unit, the one with the patches on his sleeves, okay? And he swears. Someone should do something about him. That's not right." Okay? The manic woman stopped bothering me after that, and she began cooperating with her PGY2 resident. She continued to complain about the Harvard professor with the patches on his sleeves. But she focused now on what she had to do to get her mania under control and to get on with her life. Later that week, I told Dan Brown, an exceptionally intelligent and talented clinical psychologist who supervised me on an outpatient case, about this incident with the manic woman and Les. Dan laughed and said, "You and I and the rest of us are doing psychotherapy 101. Havens is working on the 400 level courses." Les taught each of us so much. He was kind, funny, loving, and strong. Les, you're alive in the work we do each day, and you'll always be the lion in my heart.
Hello, Peter Kramer, another student since medical school days. How to epitomize an original. Eulogizing Thoreau, Emerson began, "It was a pleasure and privilege to walk with him." For his fellow writers, it was a pleasure and privilege to walk with Les. Our walks began in my medical school years. In all weather, we tramped the fens, considering readings Les had assigned and writing I hoped to complete. When we were separated by distance and my essays appeared in print, Les sent terse Delphic notes. In response to one long piece, he said, "Go on and on." I thought, do I? And tightened the prose. On my return to New England, we had a fateful walk in Providence. I said that I was considering abandoning academics to gain the freedom to write, but that to do so would be crazy. Les said, "That's who does write." On another walk, Les gave me the key to listening to Prozac. I was struggling to name a response patients had to the new antidepressants. Les said, "Courage." That was what the medication supplied, what I required, and what Les offered in the moment. I don't mean to make Les out as a coiner of ambiguous pronouncements only. He shared generously the workings of his mind. He made psychotherapy out as a sublime art, sometimes noble in its heritage, often humbling and demanding of humility, but approachable with skills you had to hand. Writing about it might be too. He mentored dozens of young writers in this way. Les was a man of integrity in every sense. His therapy, teaching, and writing are of a piece, which is to say that he's with us still, through his books especially. It's hard to recall, perhaps, and then hard to overstate how courageous he was in his first book, Approaches to the Mind. When orthodoxy was a requirement for advancement, Les presented Freud as the proponent of one perspective among many needed for patient care and an understanding of the species. In his next book, Participant Observation, Les turned to Harry Stack Sullivan, finding in his therapy a characteristic position beside the patient looking out at the world, a technique, counter-projection, confounding expectations, and an attitude, an agnostic's curiosity, grounded in awareness that we do not know people until they gain the freedom to speak. These tools constituted an answer to questions that would pervade Les's work. If abandonment and psychological trespass are the risks of intimacy, how do we reach the other? How do we signal our intent not to possess, but to encourage? Les also found his own voice. His prose is compact and humorous, composed and intuitive. We read Les slowly because the sentence that follows on is rarely the one we expect. And Les is like Sullivan, as Les characterized him, one of the very, very few psychiatric writers who can be funny on purpose. It was Les's uncle, the art historian Lloyd Goodrich, who encouraged him to write daily and to approach the same subject repeatedly. With the Sullivan volume, Les's next 4 books form one multifaceted text about how to help patients achieve self-possession. The books confront the problem of evil, and in particular of vulnerability and domination. By way of mitigation, Les suggested approaching with courtesy, monitoring distance, oscillating between empathy and skepticism, and using language and silence to counter presumptions without presuming. Cultivating his plot of ground, Les makes his claim as philosopher and champion of freedom. So that we can hear Les again, I will end as Emerson ended, with the late friend's words. Les's are from the masterworks, making contact, a safe place, coming to life, and learning to be human. I have snuck in one sentence quoted by Les from Joseph Conrad, the author with whose work Les most wanted his own to be of a piece. I can walk on your land if I secure your permission and practice respect of its contents. These simple rules do not now obtain between minds. Few men realize that their life, the very essence of their character, their capabilities, and their audacities are only the expression of their belief in the safety of their surroundings. When the therapist tries to reach the imprisoned person, he must first realize that there is no representative body to contact. In essence, it is necessary for the therapist to bring into being a provisional government with which he can deal. Much is outrageous and potentially violent in any point of view that attempts to be more than just one of many perspectives on a mysterious and largely invisible world. I judge the success of psychotherapy in two ways. Does the patient's appearance change? Does he get new friends? We need someone enough like us to share our feelings and sufferings, and different enough to have a separate perspective. It's like going on a picnic. You want someone else along, but not a bear or a lizard. How do you give someone freedom? Don't they have to take it? Don't they have to wrest it away? Set yourself not to possess or abuse or escape another human being, and you see quickly the thin curtain separating our hope of civilization from the savage practices of slavery and cannibalism. In a difficult time of my own, I coined a saying, "The unexpected is the only thing that happens." It's a paradoxical source of tranquility to know that we live close to failure and death. And let's end with this one. The means I offer are directed against absence, isolation, submission, and domination. They are a means by which human presence is discovered and defined, and a weapon in the constant struggle for existence.